The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Edited by Guillermo del Toro. Chapter 2. No human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place, which suggests evil in the face of a house, and yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky, turned Hill House into a place of despair. More frightening because the face of Hill House seemed awake, with the watchfulness from the blank windows and a touch of glee in the eyebrow of a cornice. Almost any house, caught unexpectedly or at an odd angle, can turn a deeply humorous look on a watching person. Even a mischievous little chimney or a dormer like a dimple can catch up a beholder with a sense of fellowship. But a house arrogant and hating, never off guard, can only be evil. This house, which seemed somehow to have formed itself, flying together into its own powerful pattern under the hands of its builders, fitting itself into its own construction of lines and angles, reared its great head back against the sky without concession to humanity. It was a house without kindness, never meant to be lived in, not a fit place for people or for love or for hope. Exorcism cannot alter the countenance of a house. Hill House would stay as it was until it was destroyed. I should have turned back at the gate, Eleanor thought. The house had caught her with an atavistic turn in the pit of her stomach, and she looked along the lines of its roofs, fruitlessly endeavoring to locate the badness, whatever dwelt there. Her hands turned nervously cold so that she fumbled, trying to take out a cigarette, and beyond everything else she was afraid. Listening to the sick voice inside her which whispered, "Get away from here. Get away." But this is what I came so far to find, she told herself. I can't go back. Besides, he would laugh at me if I tried to get back out through that gate. Trying not to look up at the house, and she could not even have told its color or its style or its size, except that it was enormous and dark, looking down over her. She started the car again and drove up the last bit of driveway directly to the steps, which led in a forthright, no-escape manner up to the veranda and aimed at the front door. The drive turned off on either side to encircle the house, and probably later she could take her car around and find a building of some kind to put it in. Now she felt uneasily that she did not care to cut off her means of departure too completely. She turned the car just enough to move it off to one side, out of the way of later arrivals. It would be a pity, she thought grimly, for anyone to get a first look at this house with anything so comforting as a human automobile parked in front of it, and got out, taking her suitcase and her coat. Well, she thought inadequately, here I am. It was an act of moral strength to lift her foot and set it on the bottom step, and she thought that her deep unwillingness to touch Hill House for the first time came directly from the vivid feeling that it was waiting for her, evil but patient. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, she thought, remembering her song at last, and laughed, standing on the steps of Hill House. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, and she put her feet down firmly and went up to the veranda and the door. Hill House came around her in a rush. She was enshadowed, and the sound of her feet on the wood of the veranda was an outrage in the utter silence, as though it had been a very long time since feet stamped across the boards of Hill House. She brought her hands up to the heavy iron knocker that had a child's face, determined to make more noise and yet more noise, so that Hill House might be very sure she was there. And then the door opened without warning, and she was looking at a woman who, if like ever merited like, could only be the wife of the man at the gate. "Mrs. Dudley?" she said, catching her breath. "I'm Eleanor Vance. I'm expected." Silently, the woman stood aside. Her apron was clean, her hair was neat, and yet she gave an indefinable air of dirtiness, quite in keeping with her husband, and the suspicious sullenness of her face was a match for the malicious petulance of his. No, Eleanor told herself. It's partly because everything seems so dark around here, and partly because I expected that man's wife to be ugly. If I hadn't seen Hill House, would I be so unfair to these people? They only take care of it, after all. The hall in which they stood was overfull of dark wood and weighty carving, dim under the heaviness of the staircase which lay back from the farther end. Above there seemed to be another hallway, going the width of the house. She could see a wide landing, and then, across the staircase, well, doors closed along the upper hall. On either side of her now were great double doors, carved with fruit and grain and living things. All the doors she could see in this house were closed. When she tried to speak, her voice was drowned in the dim stillness, and she had to try again to make a sound. "Can you take me to my room?" she asked at last, gesturing toward her suitcase on the floor and watching the wavering reflection of her hand going down and down into the deep shadows of the polished floor. "I gather I'm the first one here. You did say you were Mrs. Dudley." "I think I'm going to cry," she thought, like a child, sobbing and wailing. "I don't like it here." Mrs. Dudley turned and started up the steps, and Eleanor took up her suitcase and followed, hurrying after anything else alive in this house. "No," she thought, "I don't like it here." Mrs. Dudley came to the top of the stairs and turned right, and Eleanor saw that with some rare perception of the builders of the house had given up any attempt at style. Probably after realizing what the house was going to be, whether they chose it or not, and had, on this second floor, set in a long, straight hall to accommodate the doors to the bedrooms. She had a quick impression of the builders finishing off the second and third stories of the house with a kind of indecent haste, eager to finish their work without embellishment and get out of there, following the simplest possible pattern for the rooms. At the left end of the hall was a second staircase, probably going from servants' rooms on the third floor down past the second to the service rooms below. At the right end of the hall, another room had been set in, perhaps, since it was on the end, to get the maximum amount of sun and light. Except for a continuation of the dark woodwork and what looked like a series of poorly executed engravings arranged with unlovely exactness along the hall in either direction, nothing broke the straightness of the hall, except the series of doors, all closed. Mrs. Dudley crossed to the hall and opened a door, perhaps at random. "This is the blue room," she said. From the turn in the staircase, Eleanor assumed that the room would be at the front of the house. Sister Anne, she thought, and moved gratefully toward the light from the room. "How nice," she said, standing in the doorway, but only from the sense that she must say something. It was not nice at all, and only barely tolerable. It held enclosed the same clashing disharmony that marked Hill House throughout. Mrs. Dudley turned aside to let Eleanor come in, and spoke, apparently to the wall. "I sit dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 sharp," she said. "You can serve yourselves. I clear up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9. That's the way I agreed to do. I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to, it doesn't mean that I wait on people." Eleanor nodded, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "I don't stay after I set out dinner," Mrs. Dudley went on. "Not after it begins to get dark. I leave before dark comes." "I know," Eleanor said. "We live over in the town, 6 miles away." "Yes," Eleanor said, remembering Hillsdale. "So there won't be anyone around if you need help." "I understand." "We couldn't even hear you in the night. I don't suppose—" "No one could. No one lives any nearer than the town. No one else will come any nearer than that." "I know," Eleanor said tirelessly. "In the night," Mrs. Dudley said, and smiled outright. "In the dark," she said, and closed the door behind her. Eleanor almost giggled, thinking of herself calling, "Oh, Mrs. Dudley, I need your help in the dark." And then she shivered. She stood alone, beside her suitcase, her coat still hanging over her arm, though miserable, telling herself helplessly, journeys end in lovers' meeting, and wishing she could go home. Behind her lay the dark staircase and the polished hallway and the great front door, and Mrs. Dudley and Dudley laughing at the gate and the padlocks in Hillsdale and the cottage of flowers and the family at the inn and the oleander garden and the house with the stone lions in front, and they had brought her, under Dr. Montague's unerring eye, to the blue room at Hill House. It's awful, she thought, unwilling to move, since motion might imply acceptance, a gesture of moving in. It's awful, and I don't want to stay, but there was nowhere else to go. Dr. Montague's letter had brought her this far and could take her no farther. After a minute, she sighed and shook her head and walked across to set her suitcase down on the bed. Here I am, in the blue room of Hill House, she said, half aloud, although it was real enough, and beyond all question, a blue room. There were blue dimity curtains over the two windows, which looked out over the roof of the veranda onto the lawn, and a blue figured rug on the floor, and a blue spread on the bed, and a blue quilt at the foot. The walls, dark woodwork to shoulder height, were blue figured paper above, with a design of tiny blue flowers, wreathed and gathered and delicate. Perhaps someone had once hoped to lighten the air of the blue room in Hill House with a dainty wallpaper, not seeing how such a hope would evaporate in Hill House, leaving only the faintest hint of its existence, like an almost inaudible echo of sobbing far away. Eleanor shook herself, turning to see the room complete. It had an unbelievably faulty design, which left it chillingly wrong in all its dimensions, so that the walls seemed always in one direction, a fraction longer than the eye could endure, and in another direction, a fraction less than the barest possible tolerable length. This is where they want me to sleep? Eleanor thought incredulously. What nightmares are waiting, shadowed, in those high corners? What breath of mindless fear will drift across my mouth? And shook herself again. Really, she told herself. Really, Eleanor. She opened her suitcase on the high bed and, slipping off her stiff city shoes with grateful relief, began to unpack. At the back of her mind, the thoroughly female conviction that the best way to soothe a troubled mind is to put on comfortable shoes. Yesterday, packing her suitcase in the city, she had chosen clothes which she assumed would be suitable for wearing in an isolated country house. She had even run out at the last minute and bought, excited at her own daring, 2 pairs of slacks, something she had not worn in more years than she could remember. Mother would be furious, she had thought, packing the slacks down at the bottom of her suitcase so that she need not take them out, need never let anyone know she had them in case she lost her courage. Now, in Hill House, they no longer seemed so new. She unpacked carelessly, setting dresses crooked on hangers, tossing the slacks into the bottom drawer of the high marble-topped dresser, throwing her city shoes into a corner of the great wardrobe. She was bored already with the books she had brought. I am probably not going to stay anyway, she thought, and closed her empty suitcase and set it in the wardrobe corner. It won't take me 5 minutes to pack again. She discovered that she had been trying to put her suitcase down without making a sound, and then realized that while she unpacked, she had been in her stocking feet, trying to move as silently as possible, as though stillness were vital in Hill House. She remembered that Mrs. Dudley had also walked without sound. When she stood still in the middle of the room, the pressing silence of Hill House came back all around her. I am like a small creature swallowed whole by a monster, she thought, and the monster feels my tiny little movements inside. No, she said aloud, and the one word echoed. She went quickly across the room and pushed aside the blue dimity curtains, but the sunlight came only palely through the thick glass of the windows, and she could see only the roof of the veranda and a stretch of the lawn beyond. Somewhere down there was her little car, which could take her away again. Journeys end in lovers' meeting, she thought. It was my own choice to come. Then she realized that she was afraid to go back across the room. She was standing with her back to the window, looking from the door to the wardrobe to the dresser to the bed, telling herself that she was not afraid at all, when she heard, far below, the sounds of a car door slamming and then quick footsteps, almost dancing, up the steps and across the veranda. And then, shockingly, the crash of the great iron knocker coming down. Why, she thought, there are other people coming? I am not going to be here all alone? Almost laughing, she ran across the room and into the hall, to look down the staircase into the hallway below. Thank heaven you're here, she said, peering through the dimness. Thank heaven somebody's here. She realized without surprise that she was speaking as though Mrs. Dudley could not hear her, although Mrs. Dudley stood straight and pale in the hall. "Come on up," Eleanor said. "You'll have to carry your own suitcase." She was breathless and seemed unable to stop talking. Her usual shyness melted away by relief. "My name's Eleanor Vance," she said, "and I'm so glad you're here." "I'm Theodora. Just Theodora." This bloody house. "It's just as bad up here. Come on up. Make her give you the room next to mine." Theodora came up the heavy stairway after Mrs. Dudley, looking incredulously at the stained glass window on the landing, the marble urn in a niche, the patterned carpet. Her suitcase was considerably larger than Eleanor's, and considerably more luxurious, and Eleanor came forward to help her, glad that her own things were safely put away out of sight. "Wait till you see the bedrooms," Eleanor said. "Mine used to be the embalming room, I think." "It's the home I've always dreamed of," Theodora said. "A little hideaway where I can be alone with my thoughts, particularly if my thoughts happen to be about murder or suicide or—" "Green room," Mrs. Dudley said coldly, and Eleanor sensed, with a quick turn of apprehension, that flippant or critical talk about the house bothered Mrs. Dudley in some manner. Maybe she thinks it can hear us, Eleanor thought, and then was sorry she had thought it. Perhaps she shivered, because Theodora turned with a quick smile and touched her shoulder gently, reassuringly. She is charming, Eleanor thought, smiling back, not at all the sort of person who belongs in this dreary, dark place. But then, probably, I don't belong here either. I am not the sort of person for Hill House, but I can't think of anybody who would be. She laughed then, watching Theodora's expression as she stood in the doorway of the green room. "Good Lord," Theodora said, looking sideways at Eleanor. "How perfectly enchanting! A positive bower!" "I set dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 sharp," Mrs. Dudley said. "You can serve yourselves. I clear up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9. That's the way I agreed to do." "You're frightened," Theodora said, watching Eleanor. "I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to, it doesn't mean I wait on people." "It was just when I thought I was all alone," Eleanor said. "I don't stay after 6, not after it begins to get dark." "I'm here now," Theodora said, "so it's all right." "We have a connecting bathroom," Eleanor said absurdly. "The rooms are exactly alike." Green dimity curtains hung over the windows in Theodora's room. The wallpaper was decked with green garlands. The bedspread and quilt were green. The marble-topped dresser and the huge wardrobe were the same. "I've never seen such an awful place in my life," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "Like the very best hotels," Theodora said, "or any good girls' camp." "I leave before dark comes," Mrs. Dudley went on. "No one can hear you if you scream in the night," Eleanor told Theodora. She realized that she was clutching at the doorknob and, under Theodora's quizzical eye, unclenched her fingers and walked steadily across the room. "We'll have to find some way of opening these windows," she said. "So there won't be anyone around if you need help," Mrs. Dudley said. "We couldn't hear you, even in the night. No one could." "All right now?" Theodora asked, and Eleanor nodded. "No one lives any nearer than the town. No one else will come any nearer than that." "You're probably just hungry," Theodora said, "and I'm starved myself." She set her suitcase on the bed and slipped off her shoes. "Nothing," she said, "upsets me more than being hungry. I snarl and snap and burst into tears." She lifted a pair of shortly tailored slacks out of the suitcase. "In the night," Mrs. Dudley said. She smiled. "In the dark," she said, and closed the door behind her. After a minute, Eleanor said, "She also walks without making a sound." "Delightful old body," Theodora turned, regarding her room. "I take it back. That about the best hotels," she said. "It's a little bit like a boarding school I went to for a while." "Come and see mine," Eleanor said. She opened the bathroom door and led the way into her blue room. "I was all unpacked and thinking about packing again when you came." "Poor baby. You're certainly starving. All I could think of when I got a look at the place from outside was what fun it would be to stand out there and watch it burn down."